Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation by the American Iris Society. Please support the organization by becoming a member. Go to irises.org and click on Join. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to this webinar on managing pests in the iris patch. Maybe I should explain a little bit why I'm the person organizing this. We all of us find managing pests and weeds in our irises a bit of a challenge, but that's the kind of challenge that I've worked with most of my career. I spend a lot of time working on insecticides, insect control, and so on at Michigan State. For about 15 years, I was in charge of the unit that carries out integrated pest management programs for the state of Michigan. So it gives me a little bit of an edge in the area, perhaps, but it in no way means that I know everything there is to know about iris pests and how to control them. They're so varied and often not all that well understood. So feel very free if you think that I say something that doesn't agree with what you know or what you've experienced. Don't feel any shame about saying that, because I do not regard myself as the sort of Holy Bible on this at all. And I do have some folks who have agreed to come along and share their expertise in other areas. We've got Nancy Eggerer, and she's going to talk about her work with using nematodes for insect control, along with Nancy McDonald. And then we've got Terry Lauren from Canada, who's had some interesting work with using light traps to trap insects. And then John Kaufman, who's more or less our next door neighbor, who spent his entire career in the area of managing weeds, and is going to talk about, he has done a fair amount of experimentation with irises too. So he is really the horse's mouth on managing weeds in irises. So it's quite a team. It may take us a while here. I hope we haven't over-programmed this, but we may run a little long. And certainly if people want to ask questions, just feel free to do that. That's no problem at all. So let's get started and just get a general idea of what we're working on here. Three areas, basically. Let me get rid of that. There we go. First of all, the invertebrates that attack irises, insects, mites, slugs, etc. And all of us that live in the eastern part of the United States know that on first sight as an iris borer. We will be spending time talking about those brutes. But also we have diseases that are caused by fungi, bacteria, viruses we won't talk about too much, but they are there. And the last thing, but not the least at all, is the challenge and the frightening ability of weeds to grow in our gardens. That's my wife there being threatened by a thistle. And if there was a Dykes Medal for thistles, I think that might be a contender. So we all of us are in the battle with weeds too. So those are the three areas to be concerned about. So let's get started on the area of insects. And oh, sorry, I was going to talk a little bit about pest management as a process first before we talk about insects. So this is really the sort of basis of what we might call integrated pest management. And the first thing is to identify the pest. You have to have a plan, and to do that, you've got to know what the pest is. And we don't always know what's caused our problems, particularly when it comes to pathogens attacking the irises. But it's a good thing if you can find out. And then understand the pest. What causes it? What are its characteristics? What kind of damage does it cause? What's its life cycle and so on? I know we don't always know all of that, but it's helpful to know. And then monitor the pest. Keep your eye on it. Is it rising? Is it falling? Is it coming back? Is it going away? Obviously enough. And that helps you decide, do I need to do anything to manage it? What level of damage can I tolerate? And do I have to do any management at all? Often the best thing is to do nothing. Then the question becomes, if you do want to do some management, what are the effective tools that are available? And in this case, clearly enough, I think prevention is going to be better than cure. If you can stop an insect or a disease from attacking your irises by taking precautions, it's a lot better than trying to cure it all after the attack has occurred. But if we do have to use some tools, how can we use those to minimize unwanted side effects? And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of insecticides as we come to that area. And then lastly, integrating these different approaches and methods as best we can. First of all, to avoid resistance, because if you use the same tool over and over and over again, it's likely enough that in the end, insects or fungi or whatever will become resistant and it'll be no use anymore. So alternating things is a good, and it also probably helps to minimize non-target impacts too if you don't always use the same tool time after time after time. So those are some of the things that you can keep in mind when you're thinking about how to go about controlling one of the things that's attacking your irises or causing you problems in the garden. And it's certainly true, we have a very diverse audience. From Canada down to, I guess, the southern United States. And pests certainly vary from place to place and from time to time. Some of them occur every year with great regularity. You know you're going to have to handle them. I've mentioned iris borers, don't need to hit that again too hard, but that's an every year thing. But others vary widely in their occurrence. You might only see them once in a lifetime or once in 10 years. Such factors as the weather and the type of iris are going to affect what you see and what you do. So it's a fairly broad set of issues here. And then potential remedies also vary depending on where you are and what you're trying to do. There are legal considerations, and that particularly applies to pesticides. And I just need to say here that these are regulated by law, as I'm sure everyone appreciates. The main regulatory body in the United States is the Environmental Protection Agency, but each state has its own department that regulates pesticides and can make its own rules. So just because you can use a pesticide, let's say in Arizona, doesn't necessarily mean you can use it in California if California decides differently. And California often does, by the way. So you have to know what you're dealing with here. The label on the pesticide is a legal document, and you should only use a pesticide for the purposes on the document against a pest that fits in the definition and using under the circumstances and frequency of use and so on. It's a little complicated, I know, but that is the law. And I therefore can't state that you should use this compound or that because I probably don't know the exact conditions in your state. Usually EPA's overall rules apply, but not always by any means. There are other things to consider here, philosophical or ethical concerns. Some people only want to use organic materials, and that's understandable, I understand that. They don't want to use any synthetics, it's not natural. And a number of people don't want to use chemicals at all. Chemicals is a vague term, we need to go into all of that. Everything is chemical if you want to look at it that way. But by that, most people would mean synthetic chemicals, or for that matter, organically derived chemicals. So that presents quite a challenge in terms of some of the pest management we're talking about, but it's a philosophical, ethical situation that they wish to maintain, and you can't argue with that. Another thing that affects how you go about managing pests is the size of the area under iris cultivation. It's no great problem, probably, to go ahead and hand weed a raised bed of irises with maybe 30 or 40 irises in it. But you try doing that with 2 acres of iris and you'll break your back. So hand weeding is good for small. Same things if you want to deadhead irises to take some of the pests that might be in there away. Deadheading a row of iris isn't a big deal unless that iris row is 400 yards long, in which case it can be. And the last thing, I might not have included that 10 years ago, but having passed the age of 80 now, I suddenly realized that kneeling down and pulling weeds on several iris beds just doesn't work anymore. And so what I could do, some years ago in terms of managing pests and weeds just doesn't work anymore. And I know we have quite a few older people in the audience, and they've probably realized too that they need to change their tactics a little bit. So those are some general thoughts about pest management and how we go about handling it. So let's get specific now and talk about insects. And we can't list all of them. There are many of them. So I tried to list the major ones here that we might talk about. Number one on the list for anybody in the Eastern and Midwest US and in Canada is the iris borer. And I can feel a sort of superior smile on the faces of people who are in the west of the country from Colorado on through, because they have no need to worry about this. It doesn't occur here. And yet for us, it is a serious, major problem. There are other things that are of interest. The iris bud fly is increasingly a problem in the eastern US and Canada again, unfortunately. Whereas the iris borer attacks all kinds of irises, the iris bud fly seems to prefer beardless irises, although I have heard rumors that it will attack bearded iris too, so maybe it's not as specific. It appears to be a natural insect that feeds normally on native iris, such as versicolor. Thrips occur just now, in case you think there might be things other than the eastern US and Canada that have problems. This is more or less universal, several species. We see it occasionally and mainly in later flowers in the Japanese, but it may be an earlier pest in some areas with different climate. And I had to choose something for the Pacific Northwest because you can't get away with everything. So I thought probably slugs and snails might be a bigger pest in the Pacific Northwest than anywhere else. And that's just put on for you guys. And then at the bottom, just a whole host of things that often you might see, but often don't cause a big problem. Mites, aphids, cutworms, nice spelling, seed weevils, I could go on and on. So, but the big is, I think I've tried to isolate up at the top there. So let's talk, first of all, not about the iris borer, because we'll do that later, but this. If you're opening, that happens to be a Siberian iris, and you see a nasty sight like this, what you're seeing is the iris bud fly at work. It has eaten up the center part of the flower, the reproductive parts primarily, or it does eat other parts too. And if you're a hybridizer, that of course destroys all possibilities. But even then it looks ugly and it's been disfigured. And if you pull that apart, this is what you would find. You can see the destroyed flower, and in it is what kind of looks a little bit like a caterpillar, but it's not. It is a fly larva. So the organism that causes this is actually a fly and not a moth or butterfly. And so that larva, or even several of them, will be found inside there chewing away on the plant. I got most of these photographs from Jan Sachs and Marty Schaefer in Massachusetts, who suffer from this a lot. And we only very occasionally see it here, but it has been recorded as far out as Illinois. So maybe it occurs in other places than Massachusetts, I'm sure. But that's the adult. It's a fly, and it looks innocent enough, but it lays its eggs around the iris buds, and you've seen what happens after that. So what can we do that would get rid of this rather nasty pest if you have it? As I said, it prefers beardless iris, but I think it does attack bearded. It apparently overwinters as a pupa, and probably down in the stem, the flower stem, the little maggot, as we might call a fly larva, crawls down into the stem and probably pupates there. Though I've got to say that the life cycle of this thing is not well established, and then hatches out, and here's your fly ready to lay more eggs. What can we do about that? Well, clearly there are insecticides and systemic ones. By systemic, I mean something that's taken up by the plant and distributed around it so that all or most of the plant is toxic to the thing that wants to consume it. It's a very good way of distributing the pesticide, the insecticide, and protecting the entirety of the plant. And the reason I think that we don't see this very much is that we do use systemic insecticides for borer control. And just as a lucky aside, I think it controls the iris budfly too. If you don't want to use insecticides, then you're going to have to struggle. Some people have used yellow sticky traps, which trap the flies. And here's a point to understand too, that any action, any kind of control action that you take is not likely to be entirely specific. So on the yellow sticky traps, you also may catch moths and other things that you weren't targeting. It's almost unavoidable to hit some non-target species. Something that Jan and Marty do is going out hand-picking affected flowers or crushing the flies on the stem when they're immobile. That's a big job, but if you want to avoid insecticides, it's the sort of thing you have to do. And the other thing that they have been doing is using this product from Sierra Natural Science, SNS, rosemary oil extract, which is a repellent and maybe toxic to the adult flies. People are more and more using these essential oils that you get out of plants like mint and rosemary and so on. And they do have some pest management benefits, and they generally tend to be relatively harmless to use. In fact, a lot of the time they're food grade and we consume those same things ourselves. So this is a tough one, but systemic insecticides will do that. And probably this is not a bad time to talk about some general aspects of insecticide that are of concern. And one thing that's very much in vogue, I would say at the moment, is concerns about bees, pollinators, and beneficial insects, and the effect of the use of insecticides on these. Obviously, most people have heard about the word that there is declining populations of these pollinators. Colony collapse disorder has been discussed in the area where suddenly the bees don't come back to the hive. And concern has been expressed because a lot of crops are pollinated by bees and a lot of natural plants too. Are insecticides the major cause? I think some quarters have been a tendency as a sort of reflex to say, oh yeah, it's got to be insecticides that do this. I worked with and alongside a group at Michigan State who study this, and they, like I think most experts in the field, say probably not the major cause, but they certainly can contribute to some of the problems that bees and pollinators are having. But things like habitat loss, the loss of flowering plants in the landscape that they would normally visit, parasites such as varroa mite, and there's a viral disease, an Israel virus, that's quite potent in taking these out. And it's a complex here of multiple causes, which of course makes it quite difficult to study. And insecticides conceivably do play a role. They're probably not the major cause of the problem, but still that doesn't excuse us from trying to take note of how to avoid impact on these animals. So what should we do? Well, it would be lovely if the first thing here, use compounds with a minimal toxicity to bees, was easy. But most insecticides are toxic to bees. They're toxic to most other insects for that matter. Some are more limited, and it's good to use those. But very, very few compounds are non-toxic to bees. So it's nice if you can do it, but it's not that easy to do. Another fairly obvious thing is not to spray whatever you're deciding to use when bees are around. That is, try not to spray them when the plants are in flower, because the bees will be there if they're bee pollinated, and not during the daytime when the bees are out foraging. If you do it in the evening time, the bees are back home and they're not going to be directly exposed to whatever you're spraying. And then the last thing is using systemic insecticide sounds great because the plant takes it up. It's not available to contact bees, but unfortunately, it also finds its way into things like nectar and pollen. And of course, the bees are collecting that. So if there's a significant amount of that systemic insecticide in nectar and pollen, particularly nectar, they're going to take it back to the nest. And so ideally, when we use a systemic insecticide that degrades fairly quickly in the plant, long enough to do the job you want, but then it goes away so that when the plant starts flowering, it doesn't have much of this insecticide left in there. This all gets quite complicated, as you can say, and it's hard to be perfect in this, but you can try. And if you're interested, I put a reference, unfortunately it's rather long there, on this whole area of how to control various pests while protecting pollinators and other beneficial insects. And if you go to that, you can read up a more extensive discussion of what I've just been saying. So, having said that, let's take a look at what kind of tools we have available. And first of all, the things that are of natural origin, the naturally occurring organic-like materials. And you can split these into ones that are, these are non-systemic. Most natural insecticides don't get much into the plant and get distributed around it. And there's two kinds here. One of them, the insect has to eat it, it has to ingest it. It doesn't pick it up just walking over the surface very well. It tends to have good selectivity for beneficials because they don't pick it up either. One of the nice things in this regard is Bacillus thuringiensis toxin. That's been around a long time. It's a toxin that comes from a natural bacillus, which uses it to kill insects for its own good. And some names there, dipelthuricide. It is only toxic to caterpillars. It doesn't kill other kinds of insects at all. So here you have a most selective thing. It won't kill bees. And if you could use it, that would be good. But unfortunately, it has some downsides. Only caterpillars, of course, so it doesn't kill other things. And it has a very short residual time on the leaf, maybe only 2 or 3 days before sunlight breaks it down, which may be good, but often isn't long enough to do the job you want. And another one that here is that maybe some people have used this, it's getting to be quite popular, is neem oil. That's an oil made from the nut of the neem tree. The azadirachtin is the active ingredient in it, but often you just buy neem oil and use that, spray it on, and that has an anti-feeding effect and maybe some toxicity too to a lot of insects, and is a fairly gentle compound to use from the environmental point of view. Some things that act by contact, that is when the insect walks on it, but these are not going to be very selective. Natural pyrethrins, this is the compound that comes from this sort of daisy-like pyrethrum flower, been known for a very long time and available for use. And something that may be less familiar called spinosad that comes from a bacterium. One of the commercial names is conserve. This has a little bit longer residual time. It'll last a week or two. It is, of course, fairly toxic to bees, so you have to watch out for that. But it is a fairly broad spectrum insecticide with a fairly short residual time, and it's in the organic class. A problem with most of these is they're short persistent on the plant. They degrade by sunlight. They tend to wash off the plant surface. And if you've got continuing infestation of insects, not just a one-time deal, you're going to have to go out and spray several times, perhaps, to keep it, the coverage present there. Using a spreader sticker, you can help with the persistence some. And of course, the other thing about this is that new growth is not covered. What's covered is what you sprayed when it was there, but if you've got a fast-growing plant, an iris growing up in the spring, all the new growth since you sprayed is not going to be covered at all. Whereas with a systemic, it would still be included probably. So pros and cons here for this group of chemistries. And then we get into the synthetic insecticides. There are quite a lot of non-systemic ones that are very powerful and kill lots of different kinds of insects and last longer in the environment. Mainly pyrethroids these days. These are compounds that are based on the pyrethrin structure, but have been synthesized by industry to be longer lasting in the field and often considerably more potent too. And one indicator, these are the thrins. If you see thrin at the end of the name, it very likely is a synthetic pyrethroid. They can be useful, but again, the bee problem and the beneficial problem is going to be there with these things. They're quite toxic to them. And then we get into the area of systemic ones, where you only may need one application, new growth is protected. There are several classes of these organophosphates like dimethoate. By the way, the common name is first here. Dimethoate is its common name. Saigon is a trade name, and there are other names of products that contain dimethoate. Dimate is another one. I didn't put them all down, but it's dimethoate, you should note. A companion acephate is another systemic organophosphate that goes under the trade name of orthene very often. There are what are called more recently neonicotinoids. They got shortened down to neonics in the popular parlance. These are compounds that are similar to nicotine. Nicotine was used for quite a while as a natural insecticide. It's very dangerous too. You can poison yourself quite easily with nicotine. I've known people who did. These are much safer compounds. They're still just as toxic, more toxic to insects, but much less toxic to humans and mammals. Imidacloprid, the trade name Merit, may be familiar to quite a few people. And another one, perhaps less so, acetamiprid, which is called Tristar, or is one of its trade names. And last of all, and I bet not many people have heard of these because they're a pretty recent class of the diamides. And among these is a compound with its formidable name of cyanotraniliprole, with the trade name mainspring. And we're going to talk about all of these when we get to the topic of borers. Some of these are not available anymore to the homeowner, but we can cover that when we get there. So problems with these, none of them have a low direct toxicity to bees or beneficials except for one. And this is kind of interesting. The research I've seen with acetamiprid, the neonic, is really pretty safe for bees. In fact, there's one study I saw a couple of days ago where they actually oversprayed them and couldn't kill them with it. It's a little different structurally from imidacloprid, which will certainly kill them under those circumstances. But it seems like putting every one of these compounds and calling them neonicotinoids and perhaps condemning them may not be quite right when you consider their individual properties. They can certainly get into nectar and pollen if they're present in the plant, and they could then probably not kill the bees, but they will affect their behavior, their ability to orient themselves, and several other things. The other thing is that homeowner use of some of these older compounds is increasingly being restricted. We'll mention that when we get to the organophosphates. And some of the alternatives, and here I'm looking at mainspring, can be pretty expensive. So there's no ideal solution on this situation either, unfortunately. Well, that talks about the insecticides. Let's talk about another insect. And those are thrips. These are tiny little insects, kind of like aphids to a degree. You have to look hard to see them, but they breed very rapidly, and they feed on the plant and the flowers. They have rasping mouth parts. They scrape away the surface of the leaf or the flower and leave ugly stains. And they also, when they feed on a flower, can often distort it. This is an example of one. Here's a juvenile. Here is an adult. You can't quite see the wings on it, but they are winged. That's a little bit better example of a gladiolus thrip. And it has wings. It can fly, not very well, but it can move around and distribute itself. So there are several species here that can be involved in it. They cause damage to the leaf and distortion of flowers. They're favored by dry conditions. So this is something that you would see perhaps in the drier parts of the United States. They breed rapidly so that you get several generations a year. And because they're winged, they can migrate and they get carried by wind, and they can come in from a neighboring field or a neighboring garden or even within your garden and spread themselves around pretty readily. So not something that you particularly want, although maybe not the most damaging form of insect on irises. What can we do again? Well, obviously systemics are going to come up pretty well. Here, not all of them are that effective, but some of them are. But here you can use some of the alternatives too. I have no experience with this myself, but this is what the literature says. There are insecticidal soaps, basically soap-like materials that coat the insect, remove its waxy covering, and it dehydrates. So it's like giving it a good scrub with soap, and it'll kill it. Safer is a company that makes insecticidal soaps. Very safe, obviously, for other things. We mentioned neem oil and spinosad before as being fairly good, safe, particularly neem, for beneficials too. And they are supposedly good at controlling thrips. The thrips are on the underside of the leaf usually, so you have to find a way to spray under it there. But that will probably give you some kind of control. Now then, the iris borer. Now we're talking about a formidable foe here. I don't know if you recognize the picture. It's St. George and the dragon saving the maiden in the background. And it turns out the dragon in this case was an iris borer. That's how I feel about them. I mean, this is open warfare. They're a nasty, nasty insect. And if you don't keep on top of them, they will destroy your iris patch. And they're there every year unless you keep on top of them. So this is the big one as far as I'm concerned, and most people probably in the eastern United States. Eastern United States, here's a distribution map where things were collected. You can see right across the southern, southeastern part of Canada, all of the southeast part of the United States, not so much down into the far south. I think, when you get down to the Carolinas and Georgia, we're not going to experience a big problem. Certainly not as far as you get to Colorado and further west, they just don't occur at all. There's a little spot up there in British Columbia, and I have no idea where that came from, but it's clearly an error because they don't occur there. So we are sort of fated in this part of the world to have to do mortal combat with the iris borer. What does it look like? Well, this is how it all starts. It's a caterpillar. The iris borer is a moth, and it lays its eggs on the old foliage. They hatch out, and the little baby caterpillars, such a cute little thing, climb up the leaf and start chewing on it. And you can see there where there's been some chewing done by the caterpillars. They're very artful, because within a day or two of this, they will disappear down into the fold of that leaf and start eating internally down the leaf and into the rhizome. And at that stage, they are not exposed to anything you want to spray on them. It's also interesting, you can well see this as being an adaptation to avoid parasites and predators, things that might eat them or lay eggs in them or whatever. They're down there inside the iris, and they can't be got at with parasites and predators either. So it's a cunning insect, and its behavior makes it something you have to plan in order to get good control. When they've been down in that rhizome for a long, they're a rather nasty, rather large, fat, pinky brown caterpillar, or just nasty looking larva. And this is the kind of damage they do. Here it has eaten its way. It has a major appetite through an iris rhizome. Doesn't done the rhizome any good, but what will often happen there is that pathogens get into that now, particularly various rots, and will rot the rest of the rhizome out, and you've lost your rhizome, and that's all there is to it. It's gone. And meanwhile, the caterpillar is planning its next generation. So let's take a look at the life cycle of the iris borer. Let's start with the adult. That's a moth, a pretty unprepossessing looking brown moth, about an inch and a quarter long, flies at night. So if you don't look for it, you won't see it. And it lays its eggs typically on iris foliage in the late summer and fall. They've hatched out from the larva and pupa that you see there, flying at night or in the evening, and laying eggs on in and around the iris plant. Those are the eggs, of course, and they will stay there over winter and hatch in early or mid-spring. Usually after a few days at 70 degrees would be an indicator for hatch. And the larvae move around and don't have far to go typically and find an iris. And you've seen what they do after that. They will consume chunks of the iris, become a large larva. Then they pupate in the soil near the plant in the late summer. And the pupa will sit there for, a couple of 3 weeks. And then a little later on, late summer and into the fall, the adults appear and continue the life cycle. So that's what we're facing here. There is one thing I might mention about this, because it does bear on how you go about doing some of the control. And that is, I've seen increasingly several mentions of people saying that they have found these larvae in the ground in the spring, and that they didn't pupate and they didn't produce an adult. And so what's happening there perhaps is that there's some sort of subpopulation or part of the population that doesn't pupate until the spring, and then the adults will come out and lay their eggs in the spring. And so if you're trying to get rid of the winter eggs and you've got this happening, you won't get rid of the spring eggs. And I don't know how common this is. It's not really in the literature, just people that have mentioned it. And so it's something to keep in mind when you look at ways to do the control of this insect. So let's talk about that, managing the borer. Starting off with the eggs. And one thing that's always mentioned in this regard, and it is good, is that you should clean up your iris patch in the late fall after those eggs have mostly been laid, and then destroy the debris and the eggs. Don't just put them in a compost pile or on the side. Burn it or get rid of it in some way so that the majority of eggs are destroyed. And another thing you can do, which does the same, and I know a number of people do this, is a controlled burn over the irises in the spring. Here they are, sort of dried out and desiccated, and controlled is the word. Burning them gets rid of the eggs and probably some other pests too that might be included there before they start to grow in the spring. Problems with this? Well, it works better on a smaller scale. Burning over a couple of acres of irises might attract some attention from people. And it isn't going to necessarily get every egg that's been laid. Some of them may be laid away from iris plants on other debris around. And as I mentioned, there could be overwintering larvae, and you get spring egg laying, so that getting rid of fall debris won't get rid of those. On the other hand, it is a useful thing, very useful to do if you have the size of patch to do it. Then we get to larvae, and here we get to insecticides as one particular choice. I mentioned the problem with using natural organic compounds. They only last a day or 2 or 3 on the leaf, and the small borers are only exposed for a day or 2 to them before they go away and hide. And they can hatch for a couple of 3 weeks. I'm not sure quite how long, but certainly could be 2 or 3 weeks of hatch. And so you're going to have to spray with these kind of compounds fairly often, maybe several times, to make sure you've got coverage of new growth and coverage of old growth where the protection has worn off. And so in general, systemic insecticides are a much better and more effective choice if you're willing to use them. Typically, my experience with the ones I've used, you only need one application if you time it right, and you get protection pretty much complete. These are the compounds that we mentioned, the systemic insecticides. And here, I'm afraid, we start to run into a problem. The organophosphates, Saigon used to be the old standby that most people who had borer problems would turn to and use once a year, or more, but just once a year. And that took care of most of the borer problems. And I think it didn't do much to the beneficials, because dimethoate doesn't last that long in the plant. And you're applying it early and the flowering comes later. Unfortunately, both of these, all of the organophosphates here, are no longer available for homeowner use. Some years back, EPA in their wisdom decided that they'd had too many people reporting poisoning cases with these, and they decided that they didn't want homeowners to be using them anymore. So it is technically illegal as a homeowner to use these compounds. If you have a commercial operation, it's fine. It's not restricted from that. Truthfully, you have to be pretty damn careless to poison yourself. I mean, to cause problems with these compounds, but I guess people were pretty damn careless, so we lost them. So then again, people turned to this newer group, neonicotinoids, and particularly a compound called merit, imidacloprid. That's decently capable of controlling borers. It's better at controlling sucking insects, but if you get enough on there at the right time, it seems like people have been happy with its ability to control borers. I don't know too many people that have ever tried the other compound, acetamiprid, and I don't know too much research that's ever been done on its effects on borers, but it has a good chance of working, I would say. Trouble here is that, sorry, I got a little interruption.
No, it's okay. I just want to check everything is okay.
Okay, sorry about that. So imidacloprid has become the object of those who are concerned about beneficial insects, pollinators, bees, and it is regarded as a compound that is dangerous to use. There may be some truth to that. I wouldn't want to debate it too much. It has been restricted in a number of countries, European Union. There have been moves to heavily restrict it in the United States. The EPA reviewed it recently and decided that they were not going to do that. But it's always waiting for the next government to rethink this and re-examining it. Meanwhile, and here's where the state level comes in, some states, a few of them, I'm not sure which all of them are, but I know Maryland is one of them, have taken state level action to ban the use of neonicotinoids in the garden. And so if you live in Maryland, these are no longer legal to use either. You're not supposed to be able to buy them at garden centers and so on if you're going to use them for home garden. Again, if you've got a commercial operation, that's probably not a problem. And most of the time we still have these available, but they are on the cusp of perhaps not being available sometime in the near or middle distant future. Things are starting to get serious here because we're losing all the tools that are useful, and we're left with this last class diamides, the mainspring, let's call it. This is fairly new compound. I know of no direct work that's been done to show it controls iris borers, but it has all the properties of a compound that should be quite good at that. And taken up by plants, it's toxic to caterpillars, and it's legal to use on ornamental plants and in, I think, every state at the moment. So it's an interesting possibility, and I'm going to try it myself this year, and I know a few other people are going to give it a shot, see if it really does work. We get to the problems with these, which we already talked about, but let's go right down to that bottom one. Some alternatives can be expensive. Mainspring might be just the most wonderful compound. At the moment, it's only available in what you might call agricultural sizes. There's nothing on there for the homeowner, and you will pay something well over $300 for your mainspring. So that's out of a lot of people's pocket. I do have one thought and suggestion there. We've done this with our local Iris club, and that is if you're growing irises for sale that support the club, it's legitimate, I think, to use club money to buy a compound such as mainspring, which is very expensive, and then you can pass it around the members. And it's just a thought of cutting the expense down if you want to give it a try. Just a thought. But otherwise, it's going to cost you a bunch of money to use that. Although, as I say, down the road, maybe nothing much else that we're going to have available for the borer. Okay. Well, now we're going to move on to some other folks, and you can listen to somebody else drone on at you. Let's take a look at some newer and interesting thoughts on borer control that don't involve chemistry. And one of them are biological controls with nematodes. Kathy Agra, Nancy McDonald, you guys are up and can talk about your experiences with this, which have been quite successful, I believe.
Bob, can we ask a couple questions first?
Sure.
Before we go on? There is one question about is the iris bud fly invasive to North America?
You know, I think it is. It's not been a heavily studied insect because it is, I think, iris specific. And my understanding of this, which may be incorrect, is that it is it's hosted a natural irises, as I say, such as versicolor or something like this that grow in the United States. There are, I think, bud flies elsewhere too. I had some correspondence with Thomas Tamberg in Germany, who's another iris breeder, and he said they'd been having problems with something similar. It may even be identical, I don't know, not identified, but a similar fly that breeds in the flowers of irises. So it's probably not unique, but it is an American insect. We can be proud.
Okay. And then there were a couple people that mentioned that grasshoppers and crickets are also, decimate their irises, and
That's
they
an
don't
interesting
have,
thought, yeah.
didn't really have a question, but made that comment.
Yeah. Well, I do see grasshoppers sometimes, and they do feed on things. My experience is that they chew on bits of leaves and make them untidy, but they don't affect the plant. But I'm sure in different parts of the country, the grasshopper and even locusts are around sometimes and can cause a lot of damage. And yeah, so.
Okay.
And again, I'm afraid the simple answer to that is use of an insecticide if you can. At
Okay.
least it'll be past flowering probably for the flowers.
And then the other questions are about the borer. One question is, I have heard that iris borers hatch after you've had 370-degree days in a row. If you have the 370-degree days and then another freeze, will that kill the hatchlings?
You know, that's an interesting question, and it's one I've asked myself. I think they've probably got a degree of hardiness, but I think if you went down to a very hard freeze, it might well be take them out. That's such an unusual weather pattern that you don't usually see it. But we have unusual weather now, and like I was saying, we had something near 70 today in early March, which is quite unusual. And who's to say that you couldn't have 370-degree days in March and then a deep freeze? Be interesting to see if that took care of them, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Then the next question is, what is the right time to apply merit? And do you apply merit to the leaves or the soil or both?
Merit is a fairly persistent compound, and it's good to apply it early. So you can apply, I would say apply to the soil because it gets taken up by the roots and distributed everywhere in the plant. That's how we've used it. So it's a soil application, and it can begin almost as soon as you start seeing decent growth on the irises. A couple of 3 inches of leaf, and it will be taken up and continue to be taken up for a while that way. It could be a little later than that, when they're up around 6 or 8 inches, but it doesn't hurt to apply it early, I don't think.
Okay. And then how far can borer larvae move to find a new plant?
Boy, good questions. I wish I had the answers. I really don't know. As little crawlers like that, you would not think that they could cover, yards and yards of territory. I have heard it said, and again, it's something that isn't really in the literature too much, that they, and like some other caterpillars, they can actually spin little silken threads and blow on the wind. And I don't know if that's an old wives' tale or if it's really true. I've never seen it. But there are caterpillars that do that as a way of dispersing. And so if that were true, of course, they could travel considerable distances. There must be something like that. I don't know if it's there, but you can't grow irises around here, even if you're a long way away from people, without finding borers within a year or two. They are extremely capable of finding iris plants. It is a good question. I would say that on the whole, unless they've got some dispersal mechanism, it's a matter of inches and feet rather than yards and yards.
Okay. And then Pat McNeil has her hand up. Pat, do you want to unmute? Do you have a question?
Kind of a question, but also a comment. First of all, I want to tell you, Bob, this is really good information, and I'm eating it up. But your information about irises overwintering, finding uh, the pupae in the soil, we burn off our irises almost every spring, late winter, early spring. And so we have not had a problem with borer. Between that and using the bug zapper lights in starting in July, early August to catch a lot of the adult moths that may come into our patch, because there are other iris growers in the area. Now, one spring, we had an issue, a minor issue, but an issue with iris borers that had attacked irises mostly around the perimeter of my patch. And it was after we had burned off the irises. And we had some judges out that were doing a garden class. And I couldn't figure out why we had them, because we had burned the patch. And I got thinking about it. We had a very warm fall, the previous fall. And I had a dwarf reblooming all through the entire month of December that had never rebloomed for me before. It was so mild. And I got thinking maybe the early adults had laid eggs on the foliage in the early fall, and it was so warm, perhaps they hatched and grew and went into the soil to pupate just prior to winter coming along, and then hatched in the spring and came in from neighboring gardens. Because, like I say, we have not had an issue, but if we ever miss a year of burning off because of weather issues, we might get a few, and I'm assuming it's from the neighborhood. But I'm thinking that maybe there were 2 generations that year. Have you ever heard of that?
No, but you know, it's not necessarily impossible. Yeah, no, this is one of the really serious pests of irises, and yet we don't understand all the biology of it and all the things that you know might happen. So it's not, I think, impossible that you might have got 2 generations. I've never heard of it, but I would not, you know, a priori rule it out.
Okay. And the other thing I've heard about the borer is that there will only be 1 caterpillar per rhizome, but I have had an issue. I've found 3 in 1 rhizome.
They're supposed to be cannibalistic, and perhaps they are to a degree, but I found 2 and 3 and more all in the same clump and around the same rhizome. So if they're cannibals, they're not very efficient.
Okay. Right.
There's
Yeah.
one other question, and then I think we probably need to move on. How effective is diatomaceous earth in treating pests?
Well, it's probably not good for me to comment because I've never used it. The area I've seen it talked about is for things like slugs and snails, where they crawl over it. I can't imagine it killing insects particularly, but I'm no expert on that, I must say. You know, it has no innate toxic properties. What it is a physical effect. Quite how it would work with most of the pests for irises, I'm not quite sure. But it is, I know, recommended at times for use for controlling slugs and snails and crawling and pests like that.
Okay. And then there's a couple of comments from Jan and Marty Sachs. We've had good success using Merit as a spray on foliage for borer. We try to apply it when the foliage is about 6 inches tall. And then there's another one regarding burning off foliage in the spring. This is from Jan and Marty also. If you live in an area with voles and mice, those rodents can get very cozy under the foliage, especially beardless, during the winter, and iris rhizomes are on the menu.
Oh, yes. I wasn't going to talk about furry problems, furry pests, but we've experienced that too. And they go through, I think, outbursts, population outbursts, and you'll get 1 year when they've chewed up a bunch of rhizomes if you don't watch out.
Yeah, okay. Let's move on.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Gary, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks
Hi,
good.
everybody. My name's Kathy Eager. I'm past president of HIPS, and I'm here tonight with my good friend Nancy McDonald, who's our editor of Roots. And we live in the same small town in northern Michigan, and we've been using nematodes to control iris borers for about 3 years now with very great success. So we wanted to show you how they're applied and see if we can introduce you to a new approach to this. Okay, Bob showed you this diagram here. Nematodes are effective at this point right here. This is the vulnerability point where the larva can be attacked by nematodes in the soil, and the nematodes actually crawl inside the body of the borer and digest it from the inside out, which sounds absolutely barbaric, but if you've ever lost an iris to a borer, you're probably wanting to stand up and cheer when you hear that. Resistance can be a problem with organic and chemical pesticides with different organisms. It's difficult for the borer to develop any resistance to the nematodes because the nematodes are eating them. So this is an approach that offers a lot of possibilities. Okay. Scientists have identified over 1 million different kinds of borers. They tend to be host specific, which means that they're only going to eat certain things. And the nematode that we're going to show you tonight is specific to iris borers, but it also feeds on wireworms, cutworms, and fleas. So it has a lot of potential for some other pests as well. This is the evidence that you'll see if there's borers inside your leaves, okay? At this point, you might be able to run your fingers up the leaf fan and you may feel the borer and simply be able to squash it. But if you see this, you're pretty much dealing with borer damage. And down here's a feeding gallery where they're chewing through the this is an indication that you've got a problem. Okay. Borer frass or waste looks like wet sawdust, and if you peel the leaf open, you'll see it on the inside. And this is the same photo that Bob showed. Here's a young borer emerging from the leaf. They crawl down to the bottom. I have seen them come out the bottom of the leaf, kind of down through the center. And when they do, it crawls down the leaf and into the soil to start their attack on the rhizome, and that's the vulnerability point. Okay. The borer chews into the rhizome, usually from underneath, at least the ones that we pull out, this is what they do. They'll crawl down, they'll exit out the back of the leaf fan, down into the soil, and they'll start attacking the rhizome. And this is when it's vulnerable. When it enters the soil, this is when the nematodes can attack it. Okay, the nematode we're talking about is Steinernema carpocapsae, which is the predator of the iris borer. It also does fleas, wireworms, and cutworms, as I've mentioned. When you apply them to your garden, they live in the soil and they attack the larva of the iris borer before it can reach the rhizome. They crawl into the body of the borer through tiny openings in the body, little pores, maybe the anal opening, the mouth. And the nematodes multiply inside the larva as they kill it. And then at the end, when they're ready to reemerge into the soil, the larva, what's left of the casing, will break open and the new nematodes will go back into the soil. These are harmless to plants and animals, of course, unless you're a flea or a borer. And when properly applied, the effectiveness rate can reach 99%. So this is a photo of another type. This is not an iris borer, it's a different kind of a grub. But if you look, you can see inside, here are the nematodes. They've digested the thing and it's going to basically break open and allow those new nematodes back into the soil. You have to apply your nematodes in the spring before the bloom, when the leaves are 4 to 10 inches tall. And for most areas, this will be April to early June. We have a very late growing season. So for us, we apply the nematodes in late May. If you have a heavy infestation, you can do a second application in the late summer that will catch the borers that are emerging from damaged rhizomes and moving into the soil to pupate into the moths. This will also kill the pupa off and help to stop the emergence of the next generation of moths, and it'll prevent them from laying the eggs. Okay, how to put them on. You apply them in the late afternoon or the evening because they're damaged by ultraviolet light, and an overcast day works really well. The soil needs to be damp. These little guys swim down into the soil, so to speak. So choose a day when it's either rained or you can water the garden ahead of time if it's too big. You want to drench the soil close to the rhizome, and it does help to water them in afterward if possible. And we used a special sprayer that goes on the hose end. It kind of looks like a Miracle-Gro mixing sprayer, but it's specifically made for these so that they don't clump up. But you can also apply them with a watering can or maybe a pump sprayer if you took the nozzle off so it wasn't very fine spray. Okay, this is what they look like. This was May 25th, 2018. So you can see we're late, but the irises are up about 6 to 8 inches, and we're ready to put these on. The nematodes arrive packed in ice or in a refrigerated box. We put them in the fridge. They will hold in the fridge for up to 30 days until you get the time or the right weather that you want to put them on. Okay. And inside the pouch, this is what it looks like. The nematodes are kind of the consistency of damp flour. So what you're going to do is mix this powder with water in the sprayer, and when you spray it, it will automatically dilute it to the proper consistency. Okay, so you fill the sprayer with the right proportion. I think it was maybe like 1 to 2 tablespoons for one of these containers, and then it would spray quite a long way. And it's specially designed to mix the nematodes with water and not clog up. Okay, now to save time, we used a hose splitter, and that's because we could spray an area with the nematodes and then switch over and water them in and not have to keep adjusting the hose all the time. Okay, Nancy's spraying the base of the rhizomes. You want to soak around the base because that's where you're going to have the borers be emerging. And you want to get them close to the rhizomes, and the sprayer automatically mixes the correct proportion. And then she switched over and simply soaked around them all to give them a good wet area to swim down into the soil. That would keep them from drying out. Okay, we did 23 50-foot rows in about an hour. This is a little over, it's about half an acre here. There's about 1,800 clumps of irises growing, and the cost to do the whole field was $120, including the sprayer, which we've kept and we use it every year. And a final note, cutting back your foliage in the fall and gathering it up and getting rid of it goes a long, long way toward borer control. If you can get rid of that foliage, and we cut ours down as far as we can. I cut mine almost to ground level. It's going to die off anyway. This will really help with eliminating any eggs that may have been laid in there. And a weed whacker does a great job. It looks a little ratty on the top, but it doesn't really matter because they're all going to die back anyway. Okay, here's some sources for where you can purchase this. Biologic is the company we bought our nematodes from, and they come in different sizes based on how big of an area you have to cover. And I contacted the company, and they said that they would be happy to give any iris gardeners a 10% discount throughout the end of April if you just write that code down, IRIS21. If you happen to order from them, they will give you a little bit of a discount. The other company that we know of is Arbitral Organics. Their beneficial nematodes are freeze-dried, and I can't speak to their efficacy because I've never used them. We've heard differing reports that maybe these weren't quite as effective as the powdered ones. However, in almost every case where somebody has said to us, these don't work for me, I put them on, nothing happened, it turns out they put them on at the wrong time. Well, I put them on right after the bloom season. Well, that's far too late. By then, the borers are in the rhizomes, and you've got a bigger problem on your hands. So proper application is crucial. But if you put them on early in the spring, before the bloom stalks start to appear, you've got an excellent chance of protecting your garden against them. Okay, and that's about all I have, Gary. If there's any questions I can answer, that would be great. If not, we can move right on.
Nancy, I do have a question. They don't establish themselves in the soil. You have to reapply them every year. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. Yes. The problem is when you're, especially if you're growing irises the way I do in a big field like that, it's a monoculture. once you've killed the larval creatures, there's nothing for them to eat. And so they can starve in the soil. In addition, they won't tolerate being dried out. So they'll last about 2 weeks in the soil if you have moist weather, as most of us do in the spring. And they'll continue to attack the little borers for that length of time, but then they start to dry out literally as the soil dries. But it's a once a year application, takes us an hour and a half. Frankly, most of that time is spent dragging that hose around without running over the irises.
Really fascinating.
Bob, I wanted to mention one thing. This is Kathy again. Last summer, because the weather was a little crazy, we got our application on a little bit late. And in that field of a half an acre, Nancy moved about a third of it last year, dug them, divided them, replanted them. I think she found, what, Nancy, about 10 borers total?
Oh,
maybe?
at the most. I would have said 6.
Okay.
And I did find evidence of other borers having started and then died. That was lovely to see.
We found quite a few rhizomes where there was a beginning of a hole, but then the borer didn't go beyond that, and we figured that it got eaten. Also, what did you notice with the wireworms in the garden?
Far fewer of them. And in our soil, we have the soil in that field is a combination of sand and silt, and then I dig in compost. And wireworms, the click beetle that causes them is very attracted to freshly turned soil. Well, what do you have in an iris field rather than a garden? You have lots of freshly turned soil. So they had actually been not as much of a problem as a borer, but still they make little tunnels. They can allow pathogens in, and they're just gone, just gone. We also have occasional cutworm problems. They're gone also. These nematodes are wonderful. They really, really work.
Okay.
Okay, Bob, do you want to move on to who's next? Is that
Yeah, that's good. Let's do that. Terry Lauren is here, I hope, to talk about his work with UV light attractants.
Hello, everyone.
There he is.
Can you hear me?
yes?
Okay, good.
Okay, oops.
We're just getting set up here.
Here you go.
Looks good.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I've never done a Zoom presentation before, so I will be reading from cheat notes. Please bear with me. I'm going to talk about using an insect trap to control the iris borer moth. In 2009, a pesticide ban was enacted in Ontario. As a result, I had a major iris borer infestation in our garden. Excuse me. The picture top left is a good example of what I was dealing with. I tried manual iris control methods, such as squishing the larvae in the foliage, cutting the fans back to the rhizome. I also dug up damaged irises so I could remove the borer in the rhizome. The lower left picture shows what I was dealing with. I did this weekly on over 600 irises from May to October. Unfortunately, this proved ineffective. Then in the spring 2014 edition of Irises, I read an article entitled "No More Iris Borer," where the author recommended using a bug zapper to control the iris borer moth. After research, I decided on the Dynatrap insect trap. It's easy to use, chemical-free. It's also silent, so you don't have to listen to the sound of bugs being zapped. The trap uses a UV light to attract the moth. It captures the moth whole in a catch basket, so I can monitor how many moths I'm catching. There are different models for different size properties. I suggest you do research to determine which model suits your needs. I have both models pictured here. I prefer the one on the left as it can be placed anywhere in the garden. The other one is best suited for a table or picnic tabletop. So how do you use the Dynatrap? The iris borer moth is nocturnal. A single moth can lay up to 6,000 eggs. Any literature I've read states the moth starts flying in mid-August. However, one year I found a borer moth in my irises in mid-July. So starting in mid-July until the first frost, I turn the traps on at dusk and off at dawn. I recommend you place the trap outside of your iris beds. The photo on the left is a good example of placement. I discovered that when the trap was placed amongst the irises, there was more damages in the irises at the base of the trap. The easy twist off basket should be emptied on a regular basis and can be dumped into your yard waste. The UV light needs replacing every 3,000 hours. After using the trap for over 4 years, I noticed an increase in borer damage throughout the garden. According to the Dynatrap website, the level of UV light emitted by the bulb diminishes over time. The UV light may be visible to the human eye, but it is not sufficient enough to attract the moth. Results. After 6 years of using the traps, the borer damage has been reduced by 90 to 95% in our garden. I'm not cutting back iris fans, so as a result, I have more iris bloom. I'm not spending my summers on my knees, and I'm spending more time sitting on my patio admiring my garden. If you plan on using a Dynatrap, I would suggest you read an article I wrote for the summer 2018 edition of Irises entitled Winning the Borer War. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Short and sweet.
Thank you, Terry. And I don't have any questions from the chat at the moment, so we're ready to move on, I think, Bob.
I would just make a note myself, Bob Hollingworth here, that I tried this on Terry's recommendation last year and started late towards the end of August, but I think I trapped about 20 or 30 moths. I don't know whether that sounds like a lot, Terry, or just a few, but it was interesting to see it worked.
Yeah, it sounds good to me, because if you consider each moth can lay 6,000 eggs, you did a heck of a job, right? I consider any moth caught is worth it.
Yeah, good.
Okay. And Bob, our last speaker, I think.
Yeah, well, this is an important one because it deals with weeds. We're running awfully long, and I hate to hold everybody, but I think this is an important topic.
Is my seminar up or no?
Yes, and
Okay.
if you can just start at the beginning there where.
Okay. The first thing, again, for weed control is you really need to understand your weeds. And so I've tried to break them out into the categories that make a difference in how you choose to try to control them. The weed types on the left, the broadleaf weeds, like the dandelions and those sorts of things, have leaves that grow in different shapes because the growing points are, the meristems are out on the tips ends of the leaves, and that's what gives them all their unique shapes. The grassy weeds are narrow blades that are opposite from each other, and the blades grow from the base, and the growing point is hidden inside the base. And that is very true also of irises.
that their growing point is down in the base. And this does make a difference in how you choose some of the different means of chemical control. The sedges are the triangular shaped leaves, and they grow also from the base. We have annuals, biennials in the case of broadleaves, and perennials in all three of the categories. And how you target the weed depends on which one it is. And in the broadleaf weeds, we have taprooted annuals, taprooted biennials. And then the problem that we have in the perennials is we have taproot types as well as creeping types. And again, the creeping types can cause more frustration than the taproots. For the grassy weeds, they're extremely fibrous roots. And so when you go to pull them out, the roots are they bring up so much soil, they're very difficult to pull. But there are also in the perennials, there's creeping types of root habit. And
Hey, John.
same thing is true with both with the sedges as well. Yes, question.
Don, would you hit your slideshow up there to?
Thank you.
It might come in better for most people, I think.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, I knew I was missing something. All right, is everybody okay with it? It is important to know what weed and weed type and growth habit and root habit that you're dealing with, because it makes all the difference in how you choose your type of control. And the methods that we have: mechanical, which can either be hand or equipment. The annuals need either frequent soil tillage or surface disruption. Very often, if you can keep a loose surface, a garden rake across the surface from time to time will keep your annuals down. If you have broadleaf weeds, if it's a taproot type, you can you can spud it fairly effectively. Get below the root growth meristem, which is usually an inch or two below the soil surface, and you can have pretty good luck with the broadleaves, and that's both annuals and perennials, if in fact they're a taprooted type. Again, if they're a creeping type, then the spudding is almost frustrating. The other idea then is ground cover, and that's where you use a blanket, wood chips, or straw, or some sort of a cover in between the iris plants in order to hold the weeds down. And where you can do that, it's fairly effective, but there are some issues with that as well, and I'll bring those up in a moment. Sanitation, I have used fire, particularly on vegetation of the beardless iris, Siberians, and so on. You have to make sure you pull your markers or find a way to avoid them, or else you have a melded marker. But the burning will actually kill weed seeds probably 4 to 5 inches outside of the area that burns. And it saves a lot of weeding, hand weeding, right in close to the original vegetation. I've had burning hold the weed population down for all the first 6 months of the year. So that can make a real difference in preventing the seeds from germinating. For perennials, though, they're likely to still come up under the soil. And then prior to planting, the sanitation procedures, it's most important to work with the perennials before you ever plant your iris. Reduce the annuals by frequent tillage and Roundup applications for the perennials 2 to 3 times a year. And if I have the time to fallow it for 2 years, I'll do it over 2 years long. And then finally, we have the herbicides. Well, we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of mechanical. I pull a lot of weeds. I hoe a lot. I do use the garden rake when my soil is loose enough to disturb it and prevent the young seedlings from taking off. I do spud and have a rototiller as well. And I just added one more this past year. I bought one of these little battery operated, very lightweight electric lawnmowers with a bagger unit. And I set it fairly close, but that entire mower is so easy. I can lift it with one hand, set it down in and amongst iris, and clip off the vegetation really close to the ground. And it's actually helped me when I have a patch that gets away from me. For ground covers, I am fairly fortunate, just like Nancy is up in northern Michigan. I have a very, very sandy soil. And I have found that iris can be mulched if, in fact, you have a very, very well-drained soil. In other words, I don't think iris are object so much to having a lot of water. I think they object to these saturated soils that don't ever dry out. And with my sandy soil, I can get by with mulching iris. And so when I have small spots like this where I want to try to grow some iris, I don't mess around with chemicals and go into something with that. I'll try to use some sort of a ground cover. I use it quite a bit on my Siberian irises. They seem to do very well under ground cover. I've worked with both wood chips and mulch and straw. I haven't used blankets or carpet strips, but some people with small gardens will cut up a carpet in strips and run it down the rows. Before we go to the herbicides, this is my disclaimer. Bob had a little bit of a disclaimer as well. It's a little difficult to know exactly what is legal and proper to use. But in general, I tried to find products that can be purchased either for lawns or for garden or for bare ground use is in the homeowner lines. And so you will need to determine yourself whether or not you're using the herbicide properly. But because of that, I want to use just the common chemical names or what we know as the active ingredients listed on the container. The first one is chemical sanitation, which is glyphosate. Many of you know it as Roundup. Somewhat controversial right now. I still use it. I find it's widely available in all the stores. The interesting thing of this glyphosate is that you need to use it on green leaf tissue only. It should be actively growing. If it's not, you'll have difficulty getting it to control. Takes about a week for it to show symptoms, and it is immediately deactivated when it hits the soil. So if you try to spray the soil around something, you will not get any effect. It must land on green leaf tissue. Targeted applications in and around iris can be tried. As you can see, there's some dead grass there in that picture as well, where I did target the application. But while you think you might not be getting any on the iris, it's almost impossible. And the iris you see on the left is showing Roundup damage. And I know some people that put light amounts of Roundup on just to see what kind of strange iris they get. If you're going to seriously sanitize something, you want to add products like diquat bromide or indaziflam, and Bayer Advanced had a product called Durazone for a while. I don't even know if that's the trade name now because they change labels all the time. So you want to look for the active ingredients. And then if I have what I call very serious sanitation, and this is one where glyphosate is added with the product Imidacloprid. And that one, if I use that to sanitize an area, I don't try to plant anything in it till the following year. See, it says 1 year, up to 1 year on that label. Okay, now let's go to the weed preventers. The preventers are those that will stop a seed from germinating and getting a root hold in the soil. And this is the most common one that we've all seen. The active ingredient is trifluralin, but there are a whole bunch of sister chemicals that are basically the same. One of them is prodiamine that you can find. Another one is called dithiopyr. And I do get to share that I was partially the discoverer of this product. And I actually got to help choose the name dithiopyr when we were trying to figure out what to call it. The company I worked for sold it to Dow, and so it's a Dow product now. The active ingredient, pendimethalin, is also available. All of these are herbicides that will go inside a germinating seed and stop it from germinating. Now there's another one where you can buy a combination of trifluralin, which is preen, and it has the addition of a product called isoxaben. And the trifluralins and all those sister chemicals that I mentioned above are better on grasses than broadleaf seeds. And so the isoxaben, in addition, helps prevent the broadleaf weeds seeds from germinating. And so if you can find those two active ingredients, either dry or in liquid, they work, the combination works extremely well to prevent weed seeds from germinating. Now we'll go to the weed killers. And this is the ones that take down the broadleaf weeds after they've germinated and, 3 to 5 inches tall. These are the lawn herbicide chemicals, mostly known as dandelion killers. 2,4-D and Mecoprop are two of the products. They're often combined with a third product as well, called dicamba. And you can see dicamba is the third ingredient listed here. In this case, Ortho has stuck in a product called quinclorac, which is has some negative effect on crabgrass as well as the broadleaf weeds. And I have not had a lot of experience with quinclorac on iris, but from everything I know about it, I don't think it would injure if you use it at what would be a typical lawn rate. I'm going to go for one more yet before I talk a little bit more about it, but this is another one where they've put not only quinclorac in with it, but they've also added one called sulfentrazone. And sulfentrazone is a product that will kill nutsedge. And so a yellow nutsedge in particular is not as good on the purple or the annual nutsedges, but the perennial yellow nutsedge is fairly effective on. Now I'll talk a little bit about these weed killers, the 2,4-D, the dicamba, and the Mecoprop or MCPP. The reason that they are selective between broadleaf weeds and grasses on your lawn all has to do with the location of the meristems or the growing points. And since the broadleaf ones are out and exposed, they are more easily killed than the grasses, which has the growing point down in the sheath. And as a result, it's critical not to over apply these herbicides. You must follow the recommendations because you can injure and kill grasses and iris. And talk to my wife, I've killed some iris by making a mistake. So please follow the instructions extremely carefully if you're going to use these products. Bob Hollingworth tells me that he thinks it's a little bit safer on the Siberian iris than on the bearded. And so therefore, as a result, you might have a little extra margin on the Siberians. Now we go back to the Nutsedge Killers. I've already mentioned sulfentrazone. You can buy that just as sulfentrazone alone. It's a little hand squirt bottle called Nutsedge Killer. There is another one called Sedgehammer, and this one might be a little more difficult to find. But if you type in an active ingredient, halosulfuron methyl, and herbicides containing that particular product, Sedgehammer will come up, plus some other ones, and it might help you figure out where you can get a hold of it. I have not found this one in the big box stores. Now let's go to the last and probably the most significant one that is extraordinarily safe on iris, extraordinarily safe on broadleaf weeds, but yet it will kill grasses. And if you are persistent with it, it will kill perennial grasses such as quackgrass or Johnson grass, depending on where you have very, very difficult perennial grasses. They're very slow acting products. Takes 2 to 3 weeks sometimes before you start to see the kill, but then they work. They're commonly known among the herbicide gurus as fops and dims, and that's again the way they end up. You can see the one that I have labeled here is fluazafop, P butyl. And the other ones, cethoxadim and clethodim, I generally try to use clethodim most of the time. I find that it's more active over a wider range of grasses, and that it tends to kill perennials a little bit better. So that's the final one is the grass killers. Again, extraordinarily safe over the top of iris. You really can't hardly damage iris at all with them. And that's it. I've had a couple of questions come in on the internet, and one of them was, does the type of soil influence which weeds will be most at home in that bed? And I have found that it's mostly moisture, the level of moisture, when that moisture occurs, and the hardy zone of where you live will influence what kinds of weeds tend to predominate in your garden. Now, I've done a study where I have used Roundup, and I'll spray everything dead and then watch what grows back. And in my own soil, completely different set of weeds will come back if I spray it in, say, May, and then in April or June or July. And so it's the temperature of the soil, the hardiness zone that you're in, and the moisture will tend to influence more than the soil type. I've not really known soils to have an influence unless they're flooded, and then that does make a huge difference in which weeds come up. And then somebody asked something about irrigation water, but I didn't get the complete question. So if that person is still on, they may re-ask it, or Gary, if you have some others, let me know.
Okay, yeah, we do have a few questions, and I'm going to ask you some of the questions about weed control first, and then we'll go back to a few questions on borer control as well. The first one is a comment from Jana Marty Sachs. Says, we have very good success mulching bearded irises with pine needles in New England. And
Okay.
Then someone asked, can I dump mulch right over my rhizomes? I have a giant pile over at the barn.
You can cover them early in the spring. I certainly wouldn't dump it on it after they're up, but early spring, before they start, you could probably cover them with 1 or 2 inches of let's say loose wood chips. It would probably depend a little bit on how compacted a mulch might be But if it's loose, I think the iris will come right up through it.
Okay, and you've probably answered this next question. Can I use the ground cover for bearded iris also?
Yeah, and to me, that is based solely on your soil type. If you have a soil that's prone to waterlogging, heavy clay, or a heavy silt, I have found at least that I end up with rot in those situations. Again, I'm mostly sand, so I can get by with it.
And then a question about the Nutsedge Killers. Are they safe to use over top with irises?
For sure, the sulfentrazone is, and I've gone over the top with it. The other one, I think it's a little more rate sensitive. So again, it's sort of like those herbicides that go over the top of broadleaf weeds. Be careful to follow the labeled directions.
Okay.
Sulfentrazone is quite safe though.
And a question, do any of these products work on horsetail?
There's two kinds of horsetail. One of them is a mare's tail, and if you're farther south in the Kentucky region, you guys have another weed that you call horsetail. The hormone herbicides should work on both types of them. I would say they're tougher weeds though. It's always best to try to get them when they're in the 2 to 4 or 5 inch range. You start getting much above that and it's more difficult.
Okay. I think you probably answered this one. Any advice for Johnson grass, which is a rhizome?
Yeah, to me, clethodim is probably the best. It will require repeated applications and a lot of patience because it's very, very slow to kill. I have used clethodim on quackgrass, very heavy infestations, and at 2.5 weeks, I didn't think it was doing anything, came back out 3 weeks later, and I started to see the discoloration. So they act very slowly, and you just have to be persistent. When the Johnson grass comes back, let it get some good foliage again and hit it again.
Okay. And then which one do you suggest for getting rid of large clumps of pasture grass?
Well, there's all kinds of pasture grasses, timothies, and so on. If you can target apply to those really tough clumps of grass, as I call it, which is what I assume they're referring to, if you can target the glyphosate, it is going to be more active. But again, I would work with the clethodim or one of those grassy herbicides.
Okay. I think that's those for weed control. And we have a few, I think, for Terry Lauren. And let me get to those here. Are the, Terry, are the traps battery powered or plug in on a cord?
I'm not sure that Terry's still here, Gary.
Okay. Well, they're the ones that I have a couple of those. Mine are corded, they're electric.
Yeah, the one I used was too, but I wish they'd make a battery one so you didn't have to run those lines out across your garden. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And then let's see. Somebody, Lois Rose commented, based on Terry's article, I bought 2 traps. Last year was only my 2nd year, and I saw significant reduction in borer. And then there's a question, and maybe you can answer this one, Bob. Don't you catch a lot of pollinator moths and or other non-target insects in the traps?
The answer is yes. You catch a lot of different things. Mosquitoes too. Not always bad. But yeah, I mean, this is not highly selective. There are a lot of different moths that like UV light, and you'll catch a range of them. So I'm not sure what that means for biodiversity, but it is a fact.
Yeah, and just as a point, I bought mine for mosquito control, but this is nice information. There's another question: how do you empty the trap without letting still live moths escape? And I think that that has a sort of a trap door in it where they go down into a chamber, and you can take it off, and the moths can't. And most of the time they're dead anyway by the time I empty mine.
Yeah.
But
A quick shot with a fly spray
yeah.
will do it anyway. If you take them down.
And then somebody mentioned Nolo bait and Semaspore is good for grasshoppers, which are very bad in Texas. I think that's, well, there may be some more questions at the end here, but let me see what we've got. Chuck Chapman says, I've had success with horsetail using 2,4-D.
Uh-huh. Okay, sure.
And somebody mentioned they have a problem with tarnished plant bug. I don't know what that is. I don't know if you do, Bob, but
Yeah, so it's a fairly common bug that I've not seen it on our plants particularly, so I don't know much about it.
okay. And then somebody mentions we are getting ready for a 17-year cicada arrival. Have they ever affected irises?
Probably not.
Probably not. Good
They're
question.
interested in trees and such things. Yeah.
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 And Chuck Chapman also mentions he's had success with borer with a pheromone trap.
Oh, that's interesting. I was going to mention that. Where do you get the pheromone traps? In fact, if you could tell us, Chuck.
I have to look it up because I bought them a few years ago, and I've kept the pheromones in the freezer and just bring them out in the fall and set up the traps. So I'd have to go look at where I got them. But I think if you do an internet search, it should show up. And it's very interesting because you open the trap and there's the moth there sitting there, you know, bottom up, and it sure catches them. Actually, it's a sticky stuff inside the trap, and they come in and they get caught in the sticky stuff.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can, after we get over the session, let me know a bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. There
is another way of using pheromones, and that's disrupting the mating behavior. And I've tried that a little bit. The female moths lay out a chemical trail as they fly around, and the male moths follow it. And if you use that's the pheromone. And if you use one of the pheromones and it's dispensed across the field, there's no trail, so the males can't find the females, and it's very sad. They use that technique in orchards to control some pests. So I mean, it's not just a wild-eyed guess about it. But I'd never seen anyone try it or make it work. It'd be interesting.
And then one last question here. It says slightly off topic, but actually this may be on topic. Texas had major freeze damage, mostly leaf damage. Do we cut off the dead parts of the leaves or let them naturally die off? And secondly, any advice for rot?
Well, we had a whole section we were going to present on diseases, but it's far too late, I think, now to do that. What kind of rot are we talking about here? There is more than one. Are we talking bacterial, where it gets all stinky and goopy?
No. Our problem was the freeze started at the top of the leaf going down, turned it totally yellow and died immediately. But some of the leaves, it went all the way to the rhizome. And here 2 weeks out, we're starting to see rot in the rhizomes at the leaf base.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the Botrytis family. And fungicides are not my major area, but there are a bunch of fungicides that you can use for that purpose. And again, we use the endings. There are azoles and there are these are pretty good ones. They end in conazole, and they're systemic, and they will control that particular pest. Propiconazole is one particular one, but conazole, and they're pretty good at controlling botrytis.
Okay. One last comment, I think from Ross Eagle, says cicadas don't feed once they emerge from the ground. Adults are only focused on reproduction and are not feeding. I think where they do their damage is in laying eggs in the woody plants, trees, oak trees and whatever.
Yeah, they're feeding on the roots and so on most of the time on the ground. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry to let you know that we're running very late. And any last minute thoughts, Bob?
Well, I don't know if I should share this because it's not something I would necessarily recommend, but I've tried some of these herbicides with all the Siberians we grow in smaller patches, and I got satisfied in the end that there were some that didn't harm them. So last year I made a tank mixed together clethodim, which is the grass specific, and Weed Begone Max, which is the sort of lawn herbicide that takes broadleaves out, and sprayed it over the top of the irises and got great weed control without effect that I could see on the irises. So I can't say that that would work with the bearded ones at all, but it sure is going to something I'm going to be doing again this next year. So they are pretty resistant to a lot of these things. Clethodim and Weed Begone Max mix worked beautifully.
Yep, I would say I'm all for experimentation and trying to learn. So I'll try some of it too, Bob.
Okay, good. Anyway, I hope you've found it useful. I'm sorry we didn't get right through the program, but I think that's an indicator that some of the interest in it, and we can do it again sometime when we learn a few more things this year, maybe.